Kant's so-called transcendental method of philosophy, so that it is possible to have experience of these big ideas. Kant said we couldn't have experience of these ideas, and at least in a way that we could understand and be philosophical about. Did you take one of mine?
Oh, yeah.
No? Ready to go?
Well, ready.
Yes.
I don't see anything what was on it.
So, Cosmo-theanthropic imagination and the post-Kantian process philosophy of Schelling and Whitehead. Cosmo-theanthropic imagination actually is, I should say, is also a phrase that I'm borrowing from Rick, who uses it to unpack his Mandalic understanding of the evolution of human consciousness. There are several other scholars that Rick pointed me to that also use this term, some of them explicitly drawing on Panikkar, others not. So I think I'm employing it in a slightly different way than Rick does, probably slightly different than Panikkar does even, but hopefully in the course of the 250 pages I unpack specifically what I mean by that term. So then imagination, why am I bringing imagination into this? Imagination has had a sort of, and it's played an ambiguous role in the history of philosophy. On the one hand, if you go back to Plato, for example, he famously kicked the poets, the Homeric poets, out of his ideal city because he felt like the poetic power of imagination was too unruly, too erotically charged, potentially dangerous if you're trying to maintain an orderly society. At the same time, though, Plato himself is one of the most imaginative poets to write in the Western tradition. Similarly, moving to modern philosophy, you get a figure like Descartes, who also, on the one hand, explicitly denounces, or at least puts imagination to the side and says we can't use imagination in philosophy because it doesn't grant us clear and distinct ideas. And then in the very next sentence in the Discourse on Method, he says, now imagine an evil demon is trying to deceive you. And that's the very basis of his so-called cogito, his argument that we can have certain knowledge of ourselves as thinkers because everything else that we may think about, we can deny, we can doubt, but we can't doubt our own ability to doubt, right? It's an imaginative exercise that allows him to realize that.
All right, let's see. So, welcome everyone. You probably all know who I am. I'm Matt Siegel, the author of this book. So glad you're here to talk with me about it. Jeremy Johnson from Revelor Press, an integral imprint at Revelor, is here as well. So let me just say a bit about what I'm hoping to do in this hour together. I mostly want to talk to all of you. You should know that I plan on recording and possibly sharing it later, and so keep that in mind if you don't want to be up on YouTube. This is my first time using Discord for this purpose, and I assume everything is working as expected.
Seems like everything's working, Matt.
Great.
Can you hear me okay?
Sure can, Jeremy. Yeah,
Thanks,
maybe
Matt.
this is a good time for you to introduce yourself and say a bit about Revelor.
Yeah, so I'm joining you from a satellite Wi-Fi up at Earth Abides in Sheep Ranch, California. So I'm still on the West Coast with you. And yeah, I think it's a quite appropriate place to be walking in the woods and in a contemplative and nature-centric space to be talking about your book. It's an honor to be publishing it through Revelor and Integral Imprints. Let me see, can you see me? Let me see, I don't think you can see me. I haven't figured all this out either. Let's see if I can.
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear, but can't see you yet. I think you're coming. There you are.
Okay, how about now?
Yeah.
Okay. So the satellite seems to be working all right, but Yeah. Okay. So, as I was saying, it's an honor to publish your work, Crossing the Threshold, through Revelor Press and through Integral Imprint, which is still relatively new. You're the second in our series of books after our dear friend Sean Kelly. But I like to think of your book as technically our first work of science fiction, as you were arguing in the introduction to Crossing the Threshold as a science fiction and detective novel as a philosophical work. But yeah, other than that, I just want to say thank you for saying yes to this and jumping on board and working with us. I think it's a beautiful book, and I'm really excited to get into some of the bridge building into the etheric imagination today.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, science fiction is a sort of methodology for doing a certain kind of philosophy that I'm borrowing from Gilles Deleuze. And in my prologue, I talk about the role that Deleuze plays in this book, and that my approach is, as I say, part detective novel and part science fiction. And in Deleuze's sense, the detective novel part is basically how I'm approaching the history of modern philosophy as a kind of murder mystery. And the victim here is imagination. There's a kind of imagicide that I believe has occurred, and in this book I'm attempting to give imagination its due and allow it to be reborn, not in a pre-modern dogmatic sense, but and not just in a postmodern sense either, but to sort of spin the dialectical wheel a bit and re-enliven and revitalize philosophy by allowing imagination in the kind of romantic way of knowing that was born a few hundred years ago in opposition to the Enlightenment, to allow imagination and romanticism to come of age, as Owen Barfield would put it. And in terms of the science fiction aspect of this, right in the title, you see etheric imagination. And the ether has had many lives in science and philosophy over the course of a few thousand years. It's sometimes thought of as the fifth element, in addition to earth, water, air, and fire. In more recent times, in the 19th century, say, the ether was the luminiferous ether, which was thought to be this medium through which electromagnetic radiation would travel, would vibrate. Einstein is thought to have done away with that ether, though Einstein himself admits that he really just instituted a new kind of ether, namely the spatio-temporal manifold, the spatio-temporal continuum, as a kind of new ether. But in this book, I'm extending this sort of long tradition of speculation on the ether by drawing on Whitehead and Schelling's understanding. Schelling's understanding of a polarized ether of universal organization, and Whitehead's ether of events, as he referred to it. And neither Schelling nor Whitehead were talking about the ether in a materialistic sense, so it's not the luminiferous ether of the 19th century, nor is it the space-time ether of relativity, Einstein's relativity. It's a speculative philosophical idea, at least initially. I also think the ether is a reality, but that's sort of the threshold we're trying to cross in this book, from speculative theory into lived experience. But rather than think of the ether as a kind of scientific hypothesis, say, what I'm trying to do here, and this is why I call it science fiction, is articulate a philosophical approach to the ether, to this etheric dimension of nature and mind, that would be a kind of precondition for natural science, in the way that, similar to the way that Kant imagined that transcendental unity and other ideas of reason were kind of precondition for natural science, though in my case, rather than the conditions of possible experience as Kant had it, I'm seeking the conditions of actual experience. which might seem like a rather subtle difference, but it makes all the difference. So I'm really trying to articulate a new philosophy of nature here. And Schelling and Whitehead are my principal guides here, but I'm also drawing on Deleuze, as I said. I'm drawing on the esotericist and philosopher Rudolf Steiner. I enter into dialogue with Nietzsche at one point. I think the longest section of this book is focused on Nietzsche. And the philosophy of nature I'm seeking would be an attempt to move beyond both the transcendental perspective that Kant left us with, but also the kind of naive realist point of view that Kant was critical of. And so you could think of a kind of dialectic here where scientific materialism would basically be affirming a kind of naive realism. Kant then steps in with his critical idealism to say, wait a minute, the world as it appears to us is a kind of construct of our own thinking activity, a construct of our own sensory organization. And I think that's a very important move. When I'm entering into dialogue or sometimes debate with materialists, I kind of temporarily revert to a Kantian point of view to remind the scientist that that their work in attempting to explore nature presupposes consciousness and knowledge and thinking activity, and they can't, by reference to mere matter in motion, ever explain their own knowledge, their own consciousness. And I think Kant, with his transcendental philosophy, makes very clear why. But I don't think the Kantian position is stable. I don't think that it's, in fact, adequate to our human situation, because it leaves us, if not with an ontological dualism, as Descartes left us with, where you have a mental substance and an extended or material substance, which are very difficult to figure out how they go together or could interact. Kant leaves us with an epistemological dualism, right, where all that we can know would be a phenomenal world, and what might be beyond that phenomenal veil, the realm of things in themselves, as he referred to it, we cannot know. We can know that it exists, but we can know nothing else about it. This epistemological dualism, I think, is inadequate, and it has certain social, cultural, psychological implications that lead and have led the human being to feel rather alienated from nature and from one another and even from ourselves. And so overcoming this alienation, I think, requires philosophically reimagining what we mean by nature, right? And so this book is an effort at articulating a new philosophy of nature, or a new cosmology, you might say, that would go, dialectically speaking, beyond the thesis of naive realism, but also beyond the antithesis of critical idealism, towards something like what Whitehead called organic realism as the synthesis position. You could also call it participatory realism. And here, the idea would be that while we have to be aware of the constructive role that our own thinking plays in our perception of nature, our thinking is itself a part of nature. We are part of a universe which is in some sense alive and in some sense conscious, right? And so Kant, as the critical idealist, right, is playing the role of the guardian of the threshold in this book. And so crossing the threshold means crossing the Kantian threshold and finding a way by reconnecting with the deeper cosmic ground of our own thinking activity, but also reconnecting with our bodily feeling and our capacity for willing and agency. And in some sense, Kant is already engaged, at least in a project moving in this direction. His three critiques, you could say, are critiques of the pure reason, a critique of thinking, critique of practical reason is of willing, and the critique of judgment is a critique of feeling. And so, but he doesn't go quite far enough. And I think he downplays the role of feeling. And so in my book, I'm trying to do justice to the feeling aspect of our cognition, of our experience, of our knowledge of ourselves and of the natural world. Because feeling has been thought of as not a reliable source of knowledge, right, or of data with which we might interpret nature. And as Whitehead allows me to argue, actually, feeling is our closest contact with nature. Our bodily feelings provide us with an example of causal transmission operative throughout nature. And it's only through feeling, which is just at the edge of our normal everyday consciousness, a sort of egoic reflective experience, it's only through feeling that we can reconnect with the natural world and overcome this alienation that Kant's phenomenal, noumenal dualism has left us in. So I'm going to pause there. I think some of you have already got your hands on this book. Amazon shipped it, I think, a full week early. And I'd love to just answer questions, take comments, and see where we go. I think you can all unmute yourselves if this is anything like Zoom. Hey,
should
Joshua.
the questions, well, I guess questions be like specifically about the book, or can they be others related to the topics surrounding the book, like various philosophers that are referenced in it and your takes on them and such?
Anything and everything's fine with me.
Okay. I guess here's a question. I know there's like I think you like and you're arguing for like type of like pan experientialism or panpsych. Some other people will call it panpsychism or whatever. So like from a lot like Whitehead or whatever. But and you're sort of like mixing like sort of like Schelling with like Whitehead. But from what I mean, it's interesting because I've watched like some lectures from there's no one that takes like very like opposed perspective to that of like of a philosophy of nature. What's his name? Like Adrian Johnston. He wants to, and instead of taking from Schelling, he takes from like Hegel and says like, and what you like I think are like, it's like thinking is like a benefit of Schelling is he's like this panpsychist thing is what he's seeing is like, oh, Schelling's actually this this a false ally to like a materialism or whatever or something. And I guess maybe we see, and maybe he's connecting that and says that like Hegel's actually the true like philosopher of like that materialists should be like looking to for like a non like panpsychist like sort of emergence of consciousness. And so it seems like there's like I just thought of that because it's very competing to your view where you want a consciousness sort of like all the way down, or maybe not consciousness but like experience, right? And I guess maybe this is kind of like maybe a complex question, but where do you see like yourself in relation to like maybe like the conflict between like this supposed conflict between like Hegel and Schelling in regard to like where like I think like what this Johnson person wants to say is that the emergence of like of consciousness is like a sublation of like a static nature, where you want to say it's something that grows. Like you can make the comparison between like saying Schelling's like a donut ontology, where like Hegel's like a cake ontology, where he says like Schelling, like he accuses Schelling of saying Schelling starts with like a ground of experience, and there's like a of like this will, then there's something in between of like non-will, and then on the top you get back will again through human. Sorry, that's a long question and not what, but do you think you can like maybe say something on this topic? Sorry if it's a bit much.
Sure. No, I mean, it's a good question, and it's a huge question. I wish my friend and colleague Sean Kelly were here. He's a Hegelian, whereas I tend more towards the Schellingian mode or style of thinking. And while I think there are important philosophical and conceptual and methodological differences between Schelling and Hegel, the more I've struggled. Let me see who needs to be. Oh, hey, Keelan. Sorry, I'm going to mute you so there's no feedback. The more I've tried to get into this difference between Schelling and Hegel, the more it seems clear to me that it's, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, a kind of stylistic difference in personality. And part of that comes through in just their biographies, right? Schelling becomes a famous philosopher throughout Germany and much of Europe already in his late teens and early 20s, whereas Hegel's star didn't really rise until he was about 40 years old, I believe, almost 40, when he publishes The Phenomenology of Spirit. Prior to that, he had been a sort of collaborator with Schelling, and though 5 years older than Schelling, definitely thought of as a member of the Schellingian school, right? It's only in 1807 with the Phenomenology of Spirit that Hegel is perceived to have broken from Schelling, and this of course led to a personal break between the two of them, because Hegel is often interpreted as criticizing the Schellingian view of the absolute as a, quote, night in which all cows are black, this sort of undifferentiated oneness, which bears some resemblance to Schelling's identity philosophy that he articulates in the early 1800s. But Hegel wrote in a letter to Schelling, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about some of the lesser lights among your followers who misunderstand your position. And Schelling wrote back and said, oh, well, might you clarify that in the second printing of your book? Because as it stands now, I don't think people would get that. And Hegel didn't write back, as far as we know. And they didn't talk for several decades. And Jason Wirth has this great article based on a letter that Schelling wrote to his wife in the late 1820s, I believe, about how the two of them just by chance met at a bathhouse somewhere in Germany. And as Hegel put it in his letter, they got along like friends of old, as though, there were no bad feelings. And so although they lost touch, it doesn't seem that this professional split really severed their sense of affinity for one another. But in terms of the conceptual differences here, Schelling has so many phases that he goes through in his career, whereas Hegel really kept plugging away at the same system. And there's a letter that the American philosopher Charles Saunders Peirce wrote to William James, talking about his affinity with Schelling, and the reason he prefers Schelling over Hegel is, in Peirce's words, I'm summarizing, but basically he says that Schelling takes a very scientific approach. He's experimental, right? He'll try out one systematic approach based on one set of premises and see how far it goes, and if it doesn't take him to a satisfying point of view after unfolding those premises, he just tosses it out and starts fresh again with some new premises, right? And so for Schelling, there's this real desire to maintain the freedom of the philosopher to articulate their system, whereas Hegel wants to articulate the system. And that would seem to limit the extent to which a philosophical system can be an expression of a living personality. And this is not just a matter of the sort of anthropology of freedom. This also has theological implications. And Schelling was worried that Hegel's understanding of the way that creation occurs, the way that the divine creates the world, didn't give the divine any freedom, and that it imagined that God's act of creation was a kind of almost necessary logical deduction. That, you know, after Hegel finishes his logic, he uses this phrase that the logic releases itself into nature, right? And so logic as a sort of space of possibility in the mind of God, Hegel says, just releases itself into the actual physical world, just sort of as an emanation almost, like as if it overflows itself into the manifest. And Schelling thinks that this doesn't do justice to the idea of God, not just as a logical system, but as a living personality. And so there are theological implications here, as well as anthropological implications. And temperamentally, I just am drawn more to Schelling's approach than Hegel's. I think there are other important differences we could talk about, but I think that's a good start for now. It's a good question, though. And yeah, any questions or comments related specifically to the book or anything tangentially relevant are totally welcome. Hey,
What's up,
Sam.
Matt? Good to see you.
You too.
I've had some things, a number of elements bouncing around in relationship to your book, and particularly this maybe resetting the idea of ether and natura naturans on a more maybe Schellingian, Whiteheadian basis. And there's this great quote from Schelling here, where he says, nature is an abyss of the past. This is what is oldest in nature, the deepest of what remains if everything accidental and everything that has become is removed. And then he goes on to say, the true primordial and fundamental force of all things corporeal is the attracting being that grants a thing form, that delimits it in a place, that incarnates that which in itself is spiritual and incomprehensible. So Schelling's invoking that basically the formless takes on form by means of an things that become delimited become so by means of an attracting being, he's saying. And as I've been kind of looking more into a lot of perspectives that take on a kind of participatory stance that's rooted in the imagination, I've been noticing like the notion of like vibration and resonance being invoked quite a lot in different ways. And one of the chief ones I'm thinking of is Rilke and this famous letter that he wrote, where he talks about us becoming bees of the invisible, and he talks about the kind of attuning to like the vibrational intensities that pervade the cosmos, these spiritual intensities. And I have your book. I've read. I mostly have taken it in the form of your dissertation, but you're speaking of one place where you invoke vibration is in the Whiteheadian schema of the kind of ongoing oscillation between the mental pole and the physical pole, and that kind of oscillating view as being that which I guess kind of overcomes the bifurcation of nature, such that eternal objects and physical instances aren't across an ontological chasm, but there's more of a flow between where one can't exist without the other. Though, and this is where it's coming to, is I'm just curious about in this letter that Rilke writes. He talks about the angel of Islam. And Islamic angelology has this notion of attracting beings, those things which lure us to take a particular form, but they're a bit more archetypal. Maybe it's something closer to the Jungian sense. They have like a more of an image, more of a personage to it. My understanding of like Whitehead's eternal objects is they're much more kind of on the far end of the kind of Platonic abstract level and don't quite have that full imagistic archetypal quality. and yet that does seem foundational to this reformulation of natura naturans, like the way that, as Schelling's describing it, it's the alluring being that does pull something into a form that maybe has an image, has a bit more of a filled out archetype, you might say. So I guess what I'm just curious about is, in this Whiteheadian oscillation, this vibration, and the process of ongoing allurement, where's the bridge, I guess, between the more within the etheric imagination of the more kind of Whiteheadian notion of eternal objects that are less composed, more like they feel like a little bit more pure abstraction, pure quality almost, and maybe a bit more of like a Jungian or a more filled out image as an alluring attractor. I hope that makes sense. This is what I'm wrestling with here. So.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Really, really good question. It gets at the heart of the sort of metaphysics that are at play here. And so, to start with broad strokes and a general statement, the way that I am trying to understand Whitehead's metaphysical scheme in his categories like eternal objects, actual entities, nexus, which is his plural for nexus, and societies, is as a set of categories in terms of which we can interpret and describe not only all the stuff that natural science studies in physics and biology and psychology and sociology, anthropology and so on, but also perhaps these angelic hierarchies and these archetypal beings. Now, you're right that Whitehead's eternal objects are not in any way equivalent to what we would mean by an archetype in the Jungian sense. They are similar to what Plato meant by the forms, with some important differences. Plato gave preeminent reality to his forms and said that the world of actual experience was derivative, a kind of pale imitation of the realm of forms. Whitehead inverts that picture and says that actually the forms, or the eternal objects, are deficient in actuality. What's most real are actual occasions of experience, which nonetheless ingress these forms and couldn't be anything definite without ingressing or participating in these forms. So he's still a Platonist in a sense. He's saying that there is a realm of forms and that we could not understand anything about the actual world, our actual experience without them. But he's inverting the importance that we attribute to each of these realms, the realm of actual occasions and the realm of eternal objects, which you could think of as possibilities as well. When it comes to things like, or entities like angels, that have some agency, clearly, even Jungian archetypes have some agency, as much agency as like the human ego or as any animal or biological organism. And so if they have agency, they're clearly not eternal objects, because again, in Whitehead's scheme, part of what makes them deficient in actuality is that they don't act, they don't have efficient causal power, right? In Whitehead's cosmos, what's causing things to happen is always actual occasions making decisions about how to inherit their past and how they would like to influence their future. And so when we think of angels, we're, in Whitehead's terms, we must be thinking of some kind of actual entity, or society of actual entities. A society, for those who aren't familiar with Whitehead's scheme, is a historical root of these actual occasions of experience, where there's a intimacy of inheritance of one's own past as an entity. And so you're inheriting the just prior moment of your own experience and the dominant characteristic, such that a personality gets built up over time as these actual occasions inherit from one another. All of the enduring objects that we see in our environment are societies. Only some of those societies, Whitehead would say, are living, but there's no sharp boundary between a non-living and a living society. It's just a difference in degree of the capacity for novelty. And so angels would seem to not have a physical body in any sense that we would usually think of physical. But that's not to say that they might not have some kind of physical pole in Whitehead's sense, which would only mean inheriting a past and so maintaining some sense of continuity, continuity of agency. We could think of subtler bodies in this case, even etheric bodies perhaps, or astral bodies, to use some of the theosophical or anthroposophical language that Rudolf Steiner draws on. And so I think the idea of angelic hierarchies, the idea of a, to speak in less metaphysically charged terms, in Jung's sense of the collective unconscious and the archetypes which populate it, I think all of this is fully compatible with Whitehead's cosmology. He just doesn't go there, but he leaves the possibility open of such realities, and he leaves it open as a kind of empirical issue. Like, can we experience these beings? It would seem a lot of people think so. I do. And I like to think I have experienced some of these beings, which are transphysical in the normal sense of having physical bodies. But one of the possibilities that I'm trying to experiment with in this book is that physical bodies aren't the only kind of bodies. Right? I'm not going beyond the etheric dimension of nature, and you could think of, in the anthroposophic sense that Steiner works with, right? There's the physical world, and then the etheric world, which is sort of the life world of the formative forces that give shape to living creatures. And then the astral world, which is where our thinking, feeling, and willing is. And then the spiritual world, which is the I, the first person pronoun that's sort of there as the deeper source of our consciousness and our individuality. And all of these are perfectly real, but it's a far more textured ontology than we're used to in standard physicalism. And I think the bridge to that kind of an ontology from the current dominant view among scientists is under construction, right? It's not clear exactly how that view could be fully justified in the terms that would satisfy most scientific thinkers and even most philosophers nowadays. But I think it's an important project to be engaged in. And if anything, in my book, I'm just trying to sketch a plan for a possible bridge here. I have not completed the bridge. I don't even think I've started to build it. I need help with that project. But yeah, I think there are plenty of indications that we need a more textured ontology, a more layered ontology that would have more than just what we normally think of as the physical layer. And when we talk about angels, angelic hierarchies, archangels, archai, exousiai, all the way up to the cherubim and seraphim and all these things that in Islamic theology, as well as in sort of the negative theological tradition coming out of Dionysius the Areopagite and Gregory of Nyssa and others, there's a long tradition of imaginative participation in these hierarchies. And I think one way of thinking about the alienation that modern people are left in is that we've been cut off from these other forms of intelligence populating the universe. And so we feel very alone, and we feel like our own intelligence is a kind of fluke that doesn't belong here, that we don't belong here. All the while we imagine that nature is in some sense intelligible, but we've convinced ourselves that just because it's intelligible doesn't necessarily mean it's intelligent. And I want to say, look, if natural science is describing a universe which is clearly intelligible to us, like we can make sense of large parts of physics and biology, that suggests that there is really intelligence at work in the universe. It's intelligible because it is intelligent. And when we talk about angels, I think we're just, in a way, it's a short step from the admission that nature is intelligible to the idea that that means angelic powers are at work in nature. And I hate the term supernatural because it makes it seem like there's something else reaching into the world, causing things to happen, and I don't want to leave people with that impression. To talk about angelic hierarchies is just to talk about these deeper dimensions of the natural world. And we can still do science because these beings are not random in their activities. They follow tendencies and lures just like we do, right? And when we do physics, we're describing with great mathematical precision how these lures operate, right? And so there's no contradiction between saying there are angelic intelligences behind nature and saying that we can have mathematical knowledge of how they operate. So yeah, I mean, there's so much more to go into with that question, but hopefully that's satisfying for now.
Super cool. Love the angelic hierarchies image. I was just my name is Benjamin, by the way. I'm a librarian in Canada. I haven't received my copy of the book yet. I think it's coming on Monday. But just the previous conversation really got me thinking about, you talked in your introduction about the importance of feeling or how feeling is removed in post-Kantian philosophy as a legitimate, or it's placed in a secondary status as a means for like gleaning meaningful information about the world. And I was thinking about just with the last conversation, philosophy of Sri Aurobindo and Eric Weiss's work in Doctrine of the Subtle Worlds. He really tries to bring Aurobindo and Whitehead together to kind of create this, this bridge. But I wanted to ask, I haven't received the book yet. I'm looking forward to reading it, but another interest of mine has been psychical research and the sort of empirical findings that have been building up to, I guess, provide a more measurable base for things like precognitive dreaming, I guess, mental causation, I guess, knowledge through intuition. I was wondering if you touch on these things in the book at all, or if you have anything to say about them here, or if anyone else is interested in expanding on those things.
Yeah, great question. First, I should say I'm glad you brought up Eric.
Matt, you're muted.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, great question. Happy to talk about that. I first want to just say I'm so glad you brought up Eric Weiss. He was a teacher of mine. He died a couple of years ago, but he's actually responsible for properly training me in Whitehead's thought. I studied Whitehead for the first time in a graduate school context with Eric, and his passion and excitement for Whitehead's ideas really was contagious, and so I wouldn't be able to do what I do today as a Whitehead scholar without him. So I definitely want to thank him, and if he was right, he's kind of still here with us in some form to hear me say thank you. So thank you, Eric. So in terms of psi, and parapsychology, I think what's great about the kind of philosophy of nature or cosmology that Schelling and Whitehead articulated is that something like telepathy or some degree of precognition, and I'll say why I say some degree in a second, that these aren't abnormal anymore in a Whiteheadian or Schellingian cosmos. They're perfectly normal. We don't need parapsychology. It's just psychology. Telepathy is happening all the time. In Whitehead's terms, it's called hybrid prehension, where one occasion isn't just feeling the occasion in its past or occasions in its past physically through its physical pole, but is also prehending the mental pole of those prior occasions. And I know Whitehead's jargon can be a little bit WTF at times, but basically what that means is that when I interact with another human being, I don't need to develop a kind of internal representation for the person I'm speaking with. I don't need to concoct a theory of mind where, in a conceptual sense, I'm trying to create a little model of you in my head in order to, guess what you might be thinking. In Whitehead's scheme, what a hybrid prehension means is that we're actually in sympathetic resonance with one another. If we're truly in dialogue with someone, it's legitimate to say, if I'm listening to you, really, and I'm in sympathy with you, your brain is as much my brain as it is your brain, right? Like the skin boundary between us is kind of a illusion. Like our eyes make it seem like we're separate beings, but at this level of feeling, Whitehead's technical term for feeling is prehension. At the level of prehension, you're passing into me and I'm passing into you all the time. And obviously in this case we're mediated by thousands of miles of wires and bouncing off of satellites, and so this society of electrons between you and I to mediate this electronic communication is participating in this mutual prehension, in this sympathetic feeling, which is a profound fact about modern contemporary media technologies. It makes it slightly more difficult, I think, to have sympathetic conversation and real resonance with each other, but we can still do it, right? It's much easier when you're really face to face. But yeah, so being able to, I think we're in some ways reading each other's minds all the time. If we weren't, we would not be able to communicate, right? And if we lived in a world, if we adopted a worldview wherein we took that seriously, I think we could begin to cultivate these subtler feelings, which, as I said, they're right at the edge of our consciousness normally, and we're not given any indication that we should cultivate that capacity because we just don't believe it's possible. If we did believe it's possible, we can amplify these capacities potentially, right? And the last thing I'll say about feeling is that in most of modern philosophy, feeling is dismissed as a subjective, as something subjective, right? I have my private feelings and you have your private feelings, and because they are subjective and private, they don't give us any information about the real world out there, right? It's just how I respond. It's my bias that makes me feel the way that I do. It has nothing to do with what's going on beyond me. What Whitehead allows us to do with his concept of prehension is to recognize that feeling is not merely private. Feeling also has a public aspect. I can feel what you felt just a moment ago because your feelings are transmitted to me. I prehend them, and they serve as food for my own feeling, as it were. So feeling becomes the glue that holds occasions of experience together rather than just being this internal, private, subjective thing. And a whole new epistemology unfolds out of this, which leads to a whole new sense of what there is, of ontology, of what the universe is, and so on. So, yeah.
Love it. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for your question. So we're at about 13 minutes to be exact. What else are you guys thinking about?
Hi, my name is Sarah,
Hi, Sarah.
and I had a question about bridging the imagination and science. I thought maybe a useful thing to do would be reimagining the Big Bang, because I thought in terms of Schelling, the will to nothing versus the will to something, or in Whitehead's terms, pure conceptual prehension. I thought the Big Bang would be in those terms. Reimagining the Big Bang, going back into that past, having a pure conceptual prehension, or experiencing the will to nothing.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is very evocative. I'm not. I love the connection you're making between the will to nothing and conceptual prehension. Let me try to unpack a bit for folks who aren't familiar with Whitehead's jargon, what these terms mean, and then maybe I can ask you a follow-up question. So Whitehead has two different kinds of prehension or feeling, right? There's physical prehension, and then there's conceptual prehension. And physical prehension is our feelings of the already actualized past, whereas conceptual feelings are feelings of eternal objects, of possibilities, which, if they're pure conceptual feelings or pure conceptual prehensions, these eternal objects have not already ingressed in the past. We can also have conceptual feelings of eternal objects or forms that have ingressed in the past to give definite characteristic to the entities in that past. And these two forms of prehension, physical and conceptual, are both integral components in every occasion of experience. When we're talking about the occasions of experience associated with the physical elements, like a hydrogen atom or something, a helium atom, the conceptual pole is minimal but still present. The capacity for the ingression of as yet unrealized or unactualized eternal objects is very low, but it's still there, because even when we're talking about a photon or an electron, there's a vibratory pattern or vibratory signature associated with these particles or these waves, and that reversion from the top and the bottom of the wave is itself, Whitehead would say, an expression of the ingression of novelty or the ingression of a possibility into these very simple forms of actual entities. But when we get to the level of a living cell or an animal, a human being, the capacity to ingress through conceptual prehension unrealized possibilities just goes through the roof. It might even be infinite. We might be, as human beings, capable of participating basically in the primordial nature of God in Whitehead's terms, which is to say, we are in touch with infinite possibility. And it's not that all the other actual occasions in nature are not also in touch with infinite possibility. It's just that we seem to be, again, at least potentially capable of becoming conscious of this. And creative imagination, when it's at work in the arts, in the sciences, in religion and spirituality, I think potentially puts us in touch with this infinite field of possibility. And so now when we think of given these two forms of prehension, when we think about the Big Bang and how we could have knowledge of this, I think one of the things I talk about in my book is how Schelling and Whitehead invite us to reimagine the Platonic idea of anamnesis or recollection, not just as Plato had it as a kind of recollection of eternal forms that the soul knew before we were born. And for Plato, all of our learning isn't really taking in new information; it's just remembering what we knew as eternal souls, but forgot because of the trauma of birth and the way that the senses kind of scramble our capacity to participate in the forms by confusing us. Rather than this kind of anamnesis, what Schelling and Whitehead allow us to take seriously is the idea that we can remember prior phases of cosmogenesis. That implicit in our own experience from moment to moment is the entire cosmic past. And obviously we're not conscious of the vast majority of that past in any given moment. We're barely conscious of our own personal history as individual human beings. But in principle, all of that past is available to our consciousness, again, if we cultivate the capacity to remember it. And so when we do cosmology, if this is possible, this kind of anamnesis or recollection or cosmic memory, then the Big Bang isn't just something, it's not just a theoretical model anymore. It would be something that we could verify experientially. And I think the general idea of an evolutionary cosmology or process of cosmogenesis, where the universe kind of emerges out of a infinite field of potential, or Abgrund in Schelling's terms, an abyss, I think is pretty good idea, pretty good theory. The model that physical cosmologists talk about in terms of the Big Bang or the lambdas, CMB, cosmic microwave background theory, that I have questions about. But I think the broader idea of an evolutionary cosmology that points back to some kind of singularity makes a lot of sense to me. But Sarah, say more about what you're proposing here. If you want to.
I was thinking about it because I thought the Big Bang was the spot where you don't have a past anymore. Mm-hmm. So it's more imagining the future at that point instead of the past.
Yeah, that's right. When we talk about the Big Bang, we're talking about the origin of space and time. And the parallel here to Whitehead would be the primordial nature of God, right? Which for Whitehead, God is a creature of creativity. Creativity is the ultimate. It's like, its closest equivalent in contemporary physical science would be like the quantum vacuum. Creativity is Whitehead's replacement for Aristotle's primary substance. You could say it's his replacement for the more modern idea of matter. When we ask what is the universe made of, it's made of creativity, but it's not a substance, it's an activity. And so, out of that unfolds what's really novel about his whole scheme. But God as a creature of creativity, in Whitehead's scheme, God is the principle of limitation that allows this infinite potentiality to become something definite. And what God's primordial nature does, without a history, is give some order or valuation to the infinite realm of possibilities or eternal objects, so that every subsequent actual entity that concresces after God, as it were, in time and space, but not so much in time and space, but rather all of the occasions which concress in light of God's original concrescence, provide space and time. Space and time is brought forth by their mutual apprehensions of one another and of God. And so that initial divine envisagement of the realm of possibility is a kind of Big Bang, if you want, though it's not just a material Big Bang. It's also the coming into existence of space and time and matter and energy, but also a certain ordering of the realm of eternal objects, right? That provides a base note that sets the stage for subsequent actual occasions of experience to continue to harmonize with. And God's original valuation of possibility isn't determining how each subsequent occasion of experience is going to unfold and achieve satisfaction, but it does provide what Whitehead calls an initial aim. And so in that sense, God's primordial envisagement of possibility reverberates as an initial aim in every occasion of experience that follows from it. And so you could say that the echo of the Big Bang, in other words, is reverberating in each of us all the time. And so this is part of what I'm suggesting with this cosmic memory, that the Big Bang is still banging, right? We're still in that creative process now. It hasn't finished. It's not like it happened and now we're trying to reflect back on it. We are that process still happening. So we're reaching the top of the hour. Is there anything else anyone wanted to say, chime in before we close up shop?
I think it's too little time to get into the questions I have, because there are more of these kinds of cosmological questions around time and creativity and Whitehead's thinking and your thinking. And I feel like I have to just say, like, let's do like a part 2, Matt, if you're interested, and we can have that over on mutations or something in a couple of weeks. That'd be fantastic.
Absolutely.
And we have time, we have a moment, maybe just more about the creative process. I know this was your dissertation and it's been adapted and molded into the text that it is now, but I'm wondering what that creative process was like for you, or editorial process was like for you, just in terms of shaping the book. And I know that's probably a loaded question too.
Yeah, I could speak to that.
Always curious.
I could speak to that. Thanks for asking, Jeremy. It's a very mysterious process, like the creation of any artifact, any work of art, whether you're writing or any other art form. I have no idea how I wrote this, but I can say that I started in the middle when I sat down to write. The chiasmus was like the first part that I wrote, because I was waiting, gestating, pregnant with this text for like 2 years before I actually wrote a single word. And when I did sit down to write, it was this insight into the nature of space and time and what Kant had argued about the nature of space and time as what he calls forms of our own intuition, and how that differs from what Whitehead is suggesting. And the insight actually came to me when I was in a float tank in Oakland. I was deliberately attempting to kind of alchemically distill my experience to allow the specialized form of spatiotemporal experience and the specialized sensory modalities through which we human beings experience the world. I was trying to alchemically distill them, boil them off to get to something more generic that would be closer to the type of experience that we might be justified in assuming is pervasive in nature, right? So what's generic about our experience? And I think space and time are getting closer to what's most generic. Granted, every organism is going to have its own sort of Umwelt, its own sense of space and its own sense of time, but at the bottom layer, the most general account we can have of space and time, and that we can connect with in our own feeling, these insights came to me in the float tank, and then I got home and started writing. And so the book kind of unfolded from the middle out. I wrote the middle of it, and I was like, okay, how did I get to this? Well, I have to explain Kant. He's the guardian of the threshold. I need to respond to his critical idealism and show how can I legitimize, not by running through Kant's legs and sneaking through or something, but by actually engaging with his criticisms on his own terms, get to this idea of space and time as present to our bodily feelings and connecting us with something real, with the actual history of the cosmos, and not just a priori structures of the mind, as Kant had it. And so, yeah, started in the middle, went to Kant to justify what I was realizing, and then filled in the second half of the book to sort of articulate the implications for this new view on the other side of the threshold. So that was the process. I wrote the whole thing, the first, the dissertation actually, in about 2 months, and then revised it a little bit in light of comments from my wonderful committee, and then it sat for a few years until I guess you invited me to publish with Integral Imprint, and then I did a thorough revision. I moved some chapters around. I realized actually the order I had originally written the dissertation was not ideal, because I didn't introduce Whitehead until the second half of the book, like really the details of his scheme. I was like, that's not good. So it's always helpful when you've done a massive, several hundred page piece of writing to let it sit and come back to it later so you can notice these things. And yeah, so grateful to Revelor, to you, Jeremy, for getting this out in the world in the form that it's taken. Beautiful cover. And please, let me just say, I really, really would appreciate you guys who do read it, if you like it, and even if you don't like it, go leave a review on whichever bookseller you bought it from. That would be really helpful. And thank you so much, Jeremy. Thanks so much, everyone else, for joining today. Appreciate your interest in this work, and hope that we can carry it forward together.
Fantastic. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone.
See you later, guys.